Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this episode of the Qarawiyyin Podcast. This is your host Sara and I'm joined with my two co-hosts Aisha H and Aisha A. How are you ladies doing?
Good, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Been a while.
Yeah,
I know.
A very long while.
So everything's been good with y'all?
Sort of getting caught up with life, I guess. But good things come to those who wait, as evidenced by this podcast, inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah. The suspense has been building, so let's hope we live up to it. But moving right into today's topic, which is generally titled The Secularization of Knowledge. But the reason that we wanted to talk about this was because we were thinking about how one of the explicit goals of the Qarawiyyin Project is that we want to encourage people to seek knowledge. And that includes knowledge outside of what we publish and write and produce ourselves. But then we have to think about what actually constitutes knowledge. Are we talking about Islamic knowledge in general? And that brings up the issue of, is there a difference between Islamic knowledge or sacred knowledge and secular knowledge? Whether this dichotomy is legitimate, does it exist historically? But in order to get into understanding that, I think the first question that we need to ask is, how do we define secularism and secularization?
It's a big topic, and I think this was your suggestion, Sara, and I think it was just a really insightful suggestion, mashallah, because it definitely has sort of a lot of relevance to our lives, and particularly I think for university students. And obviously we've sort of recently started a new academic year, and I've actually gone back to university as well this year, and it's sort of hitting me so much more when you're in that environment about how people define knowledge and how you as a Muslim sort of navigate that sphere and navigate that learning. But in terms of sort of secularism and secularization, I think generally people would talk about the absence of religion from public life when it comes to sort of secularism. People would point to, I guess, France as an example of a very secular state where any kind of religious symbolism in public is just not tolerated. You have then more generally kind of the idea of sort of religion being separate from politics, so the separation of church and state. But there's a book that's been recommended to me by quite a few people as being a really, really good insight on this topic. And that is A Secular Age by Charles Taylor. And he defines secularism as encompassing those two elements, but then also focuses on how secularization is a move from society where belief in God is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic, to one in which it is understood to be just one option among others and frequently not the easiest to embrace. So it's looking at religion as just, it's something some people do, but it's not at all necessary for us as individuals to function. So it's not just a net reduction in religious belief or practice, but it's actually a change in the very conditions of belief. And I think that is a stage that very much sort of Western society, at least, has entered into now, where religion in many places is considered to be wholly irrelevant. And I think this is very much, I speak to the UK context, but generally this is sort of the norm within sort of British discourse and somewhat European discourse as well, although obviously sort of new political trends are kind of challenging that. But you definitely see this within institutions of knowledge, i.e. universities, where God has been entirely written out from the equation, and the scientific method is considered to be not possible to do and to believe in if you also believe in God. And I think that dichotomy is not necessarily true, and it's a shame that often this is something that's been imposed upon us, such that if you try and express a belief in God or a belief in religion or a belief even in kind of fixed morals, that can raise a lot of eyebrows.
Yeah, and I want to add something, because I think people might see that there's maybe a dichotomy between a university setting or an academic setting that's totally secular, where any belief in God is kind of seen as problematic, or the opposite, where it's generally understood that people are there pursuing knowledge with the understanding that like, you know, like under a theological framework, whether Islamic or Christian or otherwise. But then maybe people say that like, okay, well, there's something in between, which is like we all kind of acknowledge that there's like different religious expressions, and they're all equally valid, and we can all study like the same knowledge under the same roof. And while we do, you know, like we do live in mixed societies with, and we're able to coexist with people, like Muslims have always coexisted with people of like different, you know, theological inclinations. We have to be careful of like falling into perennialism, which is this like belief that, you know, there are different like valid expressions of religiosity and belief in God, and not that like not believing in perennialism doesn't mean that like I'm not going to allow other people to like have other religions, like the Iqra deen. We don't like lakum deenukum waliya deen. Like we allow other people, we believe that other people have a right to follow their own religion, but we will not make the statement or like hold the belief that that is an equally valid religion to Islam. So I just wanted to like put that out there that you know, as we like navigate being a Muslim in like mixed spaces and stuff, that we have to be careful to not just like put Islam on an equal playing field with like other theologies or the lack thereof. But then if we're talking about, you know, if that's like the definition of secularism that Aisha H just provided, how about when we're talking about knowledge specifically? How does knowledge get secularized? Or what does that look like, say, in a university setting?
So I think, Sarah, you actually put it to us in the run-up to us preparing for this podcast about how it tends to manifest or comes about in two specific ways. One, where you think that the knowledge that you're studying is not related to Islam. You know, it's very much a reflection on just secularization of religion in general or in society, where, you know, you've got your religious practices which you do at home or in the masjid, and then everything else which is, you know, daily life. The same goes for knowledge that you learn in universities. That's what you deal with in daily life. But, you know, religion doesn't really have a sphere or any sort of implication on that knowledge that you're learning. And then the second equally problematic approach is when you use that knowledge that you pick up in universities in an un-Islamic way. University, I think, is such a critical point in a lot of people's lives because it's the first point where you're challenged and pushed to think about things for yourself. And there was a point in time, also I'm told by my parents, where these were really places of, you know, intellectual curiosity and discourse, and, you know, where you would explore things and come to conclusions and that sort of thing, versus being fed a certain narrative, you know, like in schools, for example, when you're told what to think and believe. However, I can't really say that universities afford us the same privileges as they did in those days with respect to freedom to think and come to your own conclusions. For example, when I was at med school, there was this whole idea of religion being very incompatible with science specifically was really manifest because we had lectures, for example, about psychology and psychiatry, and differentiating between people who are mad versus people who just had religious beliefs. And I kid you not, this was, you know, posited by the lecturer, and it was basically saying, so hallucination or psychosis is belief, an unshakable belief in something that you cannot, no matter how many evidences are given to you towards the contrary, you believe it despite all of that, right? And they said, and then they added as an addendum to that, this does not include religious belief. Like, you know, the whole lead up, and I'm not doing it any justice because I literally sat there with my mouth open. The whole lead up was, you're crazy, you can be hearing things and seeing things and putting explanations to things that are completely untrue. But we're not talking about religion. So it would be things like, you know, if you believed, for example, as Muslims do, in the ghaib, or in, you know, the, you know, belief in angels, or belief in the hereafter, belief in God even, you know, things that you can't physically or scientifically, you know, measure in this world, then you're crazy. But they can't say that out loud, even though everything else they were saying was saying that.
So they believe that, but they just added that addendum so it's not like problematic.
So they were
bigoted.
PC, yeah. It was just for political correctness, and because they were like people with Sikh turbans and Muslim headscarves sat in the audience, and they're like, oh yeah, we can't say this out loud. But it was really funny. I don't know, have you guys had experiences like that at university?
Yeah, honestly, first of all, like what you're saying about like experiencing that in med school, I think that is like just like a really key point to mention, because people think that when you're in the hard sciences, everything is just data and measuring things, and like, you know, it's all just like immutable information. It doesn't matter if you approach it from like a theological or secular approach. The information is what it is, but that's totally not the case. Like this issue of secularization isn't just present like in the social sciences and the humanities, like in religious studies and stuff. But for me, and like Aisha H, actually, like we've studied, I think, like basically the same discipline, but for me, like so my major was political economy, which is like less applied economics and more looking at systems, like systems of governance from both a political and an economic perspective. And the thing is, in order to talk about how humans should govern themselves from like a holistic perspective, you also have to talk about human nature. So we did get into like, you know, like philosophical discussions about like how humans actually like think, how they work, how they organize themselves into societies. That gets into like talking about families, because the family is like the base unit of the larger society. So I remember, and I think I mentioned this in like a prior episode too, where in one of my political economy courses, the professor explicitly was like, yeah, so some of these like liberal thinkers that we're talking about, like we were reading like Locke and Hobbes, they like talk about, you know, the state of nature, and they do like explicitly believe that like God has created humans in a state of nature, and then they organize themselves into society or whatever. He's like, yeah, by the way, like that doesn't actually exist. We're just studying what these people think as like, you know, from a theoretical standpoint. But when you're actually writing in your essays about like whether or not they're accurate and stuff, like, you know, that's all nonsense. So that was like one, you know, aspect where it was like just like really explicitly stated that was the case. But then even like in general with, and this is more so in political science too, where it's just kind of like at a base level understood that like democracy and pluralism are these like the highest values and like the best systems possible, and that like they kind of like it's implied in there that like moral relativism is, you know, like that's the default. We're not gonna like believe in some universal moral system that's passed down from like a book, from revelation, from like one person who claims to be a prophet or whatever. That is like less explicitly stated, but like when you dig deeper, you realize like that is what's being said. But Aisha H, I want to know what like your experience was, because we both like studied development, but I think you were more on like the economic side of things.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I completely agree with what you're saying. I think the thing that strikes and has struck in the past me most is always this reluctance on the part of others to just acknowledge that anybody might have different moral foundations or a different worldview, in the way in which they approach things, a different lens with which they view the world, and they're absolutely loath to acknowledge that that could be in any way influenced by religion. I think definitely sort of in the scene that we're talking about, religion has very much been used to something that is aesthetic, something that is cultural, something that allows you to sort of appreciate just, you know, the beauty of the world, but it doesn't actually have any impact on your day-to-day actions. And it's a shame as well, because I find that this is as well where a lot of the rhetoric surrounding decoloniality really falls short, in that there's been this big sort of drive, or not a big drive, I say big because in institutions that I am or was in, it was big, but I sometimes come out of that bubble and realise that it's really not everywhere. But there has been some pushback against sort of an Orientalist or post-colonial kind of narrative of the world and the way in which we view other cultures as a result of our historical experience. And there's been a push to sort of just try and, decolonize the way in which we view things. But as you said, there are some values that they will never touch. Definitely democracy, and definitely pluralism is one of them. And it's not about, you know, wanting to sort of be like, I don't know, anarchists and just say that there are no rules, but the point is that they just don't allow actually any real pluralism to exist by excluding people who have a different attitude or a different interpretation of the way in which morals and ideals should be implemented in society. And for me, that just has posed a lot of challenges in terms of if I'm ever trying to bring up something that is relevant to an issue, but something that stems from my religious standpoint, it can just become very awkward. You kind of feel like you are doing or saying something wrong by even bringing this up in the first place, because it just feels so ill-suited to the discussion that you're in. It's like people would be like, why, what relevance has that got to this? You know, you think that, but so what? And I think that it kind of really exposes the idea that the academy or universities are, as Aisha was saying, real kind of impartial institutions of knowledge, and that people can sort of share whatever opinions that they have there. And I think very much sort of in this day and age, as Aisha was saying, sort of compared to my parents' generation, at least in the UK, it seems to be very, very different. And I think just the overemphasis on political correctness and people upholding everybody's rights all the time has really shut down a lot of conversation for anybody to engage with the deeper foundational questions behind those issues.
You know, that reminded me of like another example from a class that I was taking, and I do want to like mention as many of our own personal experiences in this as possible to, you know, either for other students who are gonna go through similar experiences or who have experienced similar things. I think it might make this, what could seem like this abstract theoretical issue of secularism, like a lot more real and relevant. But like I was taking a class called History of Neoliberalism, and in one of our discussions we got into this really weird like abstract moral debate about like where to get like the standards for a justice system. They were talking about like prisons and stuff, and how do we agree on like what constitutes as like a just punishment for certain crimes and stuff like this. And they were basically debating like moral relativism. And then I was just like, yeah, you know, honestly, like I believe in like a set universal moral standard, like a moral system that is Islam, that has a justice system. And I didn't like mention hudud, but like that's what I was talking about. And like the thing is, like people just kind of like the professor just looked at me, and then class ended, and it was like, do you know, it was like, I don't know, like that was the first time that I was like that I said something like that in a class. And it was also my last semester, so it took me a long time to get
my first and last class.
Yeah, so it was like, but it was interesting because like some of the people in that class, like I remember one girl came up to me afterwards and was like, what you were saying was actually pretty interesting, and like I agree with like a lot with what you're saying in terms of like that we can't have just like, you know, like a justice system that's like within like on top of a foundation of moral relativism. And she was like, yeah, I think a lot of the people in that class are like not actually saying what they believe, you know. Like everybody like approaches their like moral disagreements or their political disagreements, but like we don't actually get into it. And that goes back to like what Aisha A was saying, that like a lot of universities now are not actually places of like they're not open forums for like pluralism and, you know, open-minded discussion. Like especially at my school, like there was the thing is they made it seem like everybody was like super radical or whatever. No, like they all said the same thing and like called it radical. Like that's it. There wasn't actually radical disagreement.
I think you'll find that, to be honest, in most spheres of discussion, because, you know, they have a claim to this, oh, we're very liberal and we accept all sorts of views and opinions. But really, if you start listening to them, there's a very certain specific narrative that everyone is pushing and everyone's saying the same thing, just like you were saying, Sarah. And to hear someone or anyone go against that is really rare and frowned upon, and you get chased out almost, you know, before you can even say anything. I was going to give another example that a friend of mine who is studying psychiatry was telling me, at the risk, I'm not going to do it justice. I'm going to say that now because obviously she can tell the story a lot better, but for the sake of sharing the lessons that she learned. And this is sort of to emphasize that, look, I think a lot of the times we as Muslims, given everything we faced in the media and even just the world in general today, a lot of us are very scared to even showcase that we're Muslims or that our ideas come from an Islamic place, for fear of isolation or being heralded as being backwards, etc., etc. But this was an example of where it just goes to show that there are, I really don't want to put it like this, but there are benefits for other people, but genuinely there is a massive benefit in Islam, and Allah sent it as a savior. It's for the salvation of mankind, right?
Absolutely.
And we have to remember that no matter how ridiculed or crazy people make it sound, right? So for example, this friend of mine, she was in a session where they were talking about, so obviously she's training to become a psychologist, and they were talking about different status quos of people. I forget the term that she used, but it was basically the idea that people had different realities. So they were talking about depression, and so she shared about how, and they were talking about depression and different communities' views on it, etc., etc. And this, to put it into context, was it was south of London, so it was a very, very white, rather heterogeneous class and population. Most of them had the same experiences, except my friend, who was Muslim and came from a minority group. And she was saying, well, yeah, for example, people in the South Asian / Bengali community, they don't actually have a word for depression. They just accept that a woman, after she gives birth, she goes home to her mum, they spend 40 days there, the community looks after her, and in so many ways, they just look after them, and they don't bother putting this label of depression, or the way that in the language that they use it is depression, or the sadness was upon me. Not so much I am depressed, as though it's a state of being, but this is something I am being subjected to. And the class apparently was just completely gobsmacked that there was this whole other viewpoint, that there was this whole other reality to the one that they had accepted. And I think sometimes we have to realize that, look, Islam does have really unique, really special and valuable perspectives and solutions to a lot of the problems we see in society today. And we are remiss if we don't share these with the world, because otherwise who will?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And on that again, this is one of the books that we recommended a couple of reading lists ago, which was Sustenance of the Soul by Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, which was written in I forget which century, 11th century or earlier. If I'm totally off the mark, I'm sorry. But basically, this was kind of
a long time
it's a manual.
Ago.
Yeah, it's hella old. But it's a manual on mental health that was written by a Muslim scholar. And it wasn't translated into English that long ago. Dr. Malik Badri translated it, published it, and then a bunch of Western, psychology academics started reading it and were like, yo, this is pretty groundbreaking. This is a conception of the concepts of depression, and then severe depression, clinical depression, psychosis that we've only in the past few decades have come up with. But a lot of people will look at the Muslim world and be like, yeah, they've been studying fiqh and aqidah for hella centuries, and they didn't focus on these quote unquote secular sources of knowledge, and that's why the Muslim world is backwards. That's not the case at all, and that just goes to show that historically there wasn't this separation within the Muslim world, and in these circles of scholarship, there wasn't a separation between secular knowledge and Islamic knowledge. It was all just knowledge of the dunya that Allah created, and all of these sciences and everything fall into that, and they don't study them separate from the reality that that these things are created by Allah, and that they all return to Him eventually.
And carrying on, just to emphasize that point, my dad's a massive space and astronomy buff, but I was just looking up star names, and apparently in Western astronomy, most of the accepted star names are actually in Arabic. There are a few Greek ones and some of unknown origin, but majority are in Arabic, because obviously, as we know, during the Islamic, golden period, or its heyday, astronomy was one of the massive fields that they were making strides in alongside the other sciences, which just goes to prove that this perceived incompatibility of scientific progression and religion is a complete fallacy. Muslims back in the day didn't have any problem with it. I don't know why these guys are.
Yeah, coming off of that, Aisha, I think really this sort of separation between religious knowledge and scientific knowledge really came and was a product of the Enlightenment. But what was it that sort of stimulated the Enlightenment? Yes, it was all of these philosophers and these thinkers who started putting down their ideas, but many of them, whether they sort of resisted God or religion or not, were trying to find an alternative to sort of a very clerical class within pre-modern European societies who had controlled the dissemination of knowledge and who had resisted other types of scientific and technological innovation, and, you know, deemed it as witchcraft or sorcery or whatever it may be. In Islam, we never had this friction between knowledge of the world and Islamic knowledge, because Muhammad ﷺ encouraged us so many times to seek knowledge as an ummah, and at the same time use that to strengthen our own deen. So I think this is very much a product of Western historical experience in the way in which sort of this sort of divorce between sort of the religious and the scientific has emerged.
Yeah. Also, another thing that is like really specifically a product of the like European historical experience is not only the separation of like secular and sacred knowledge, but also just the way that the sciences are organized and divided within the Western academy. And there's like more that people can read about this if they want to. Immanuel Wallerstein has written this book called World Systems Analysis that I actually really recommend. And it's a pretty short read, and it's really interesting. It's also kind of like an introduction to like an approach to political economy if anybody's interested in the field. But in the beginning, he does talk about like the division of the social sciences and how there came to be these different disciplines that we call like sociology, anthropology, whatever, like political science, economics. And the thing is, like, I think we often go into university with the assumption that these are just like, this is what knowledge is organized into, that these are like, you know, organic, like the knowledge has always been kind of divided into these different areas. But the thing is, like, when people, like certain people decided that like, okay, this is how we're going to study this field, and that like, and then they lay down what the principles of that field are. So you'll take like an intro to sociology class, and it'll say like, okay, sociology is defined as this, these are the basic principles of the field. And then here are like different approaches that theorists within the field have taken to like studying it and da-da-da. But like that base, like that you're given, the like definition and the principles, that was like invented by like the first person who, you know, decided to compile it, and then other people decided like, oh yeah, we're gonna go with what this dude said. So like even the way that like knowledge is organized within the academy isn't like, we can question that and be skeptical of that, and go back to the roots of it and think about, okay, is this actually, you know, can we study like the way humans buy and sell without studying the way that they, you know, think and the way that they believe, the way that they worship. So, and that like again ties back to separating, you know, whatever like the secular sciences are, what we think they are, from deen, from like belief in God. But moving on to like how, now that we've kind of discussed, okay, this is how secularization of knowledge looks in the university setting, what's the impact of this approach on like us as individuals, on society at large? And with that in mind, how do we as Muslims approach knowledge then? Do we, you know, can we like pick up this knowledge and then like later try to superimpose like an Islamic perspective on it, or what? Like what should, you know, what's the port of call now?
I think that ultimately the result of this approach, first of all, sort of on, I guess, a more societal level, and also post-education, post-university, post-schooling, kind of looking at it in kind of a more long-run impact. I think we've seen that it essentially relegates religion to the private sphere. That is sort of a pretty obvious observation of most, if not all, absolutely all Western countries today. But also very much that even your private beliefs do eventually also get sort of washed away and eroded over time as well. Ultimately, if they're not having much impact on your day-to-day life and it's only behind closed doors, eventually you're going to sort of question the point of them altogether. And I think that this is why we've seen sort of people turn, especially I guess, you know, millennials, the new younger generation, turn more towards the idea of just spiritualism, things like Buddhism, to fulfill their spiritual instinct, but without the sort of rules and regulations that religion is considered to unnecessarily impose upon people. And I think that is definitely something as well that as a Muslim community we need to be very wary of. And alhamdulillah, I do think that, you know, ulama, activists and dawah carriers are concerned about a move towards that. And unfortunately, you do already see some people differentiating between their private beliefs, what they would do, and what they endorse. people often, I see just sometimes with being on social media or sort of in their professional or their academic work, sometimes they endorse things or share things that I know they as a Muslim wouldn't do, or they as a Muslim don't believe in. But they've been able to make this distinction between what I personally believe and what everybody else does, what is, they believe in, and that's okay as well. And sort of what you're saying in the beginning, that's an equally valid thing to do. We're not saying that they should be going out there stopping everybody from doing whatever it is that we as Muslims don't believe in, but we shouldn't be endorsing it. And unfortunately, people seem to have some people, obviously not everybody, seem to have kind of embraced this idea of us and them, or me at home among certain people, or me as a personal, me and my personal religion, and me and how I view the rest of the world and society.
I was just gonna add to that, actually, a really interesting point about how, obviously I echo everything that Aisha was saying. The less time you spend thinking about this, the more, the further away you get from your Islamic values. Because listen, you spend 8 hours a day at school or university, and the less, obviously, you then begin to prioritize the secular knowledge that you have over any sort of Islamic knowledge that you have or are seeking. And it almost, the secularization of this knowledge and of society in general almost fools you into thinking that, if you're religious, then the only way to be religious and studying is if you wear, I don't know, a topi and you go to an Alamiya school, or, you completely divest yourself from this world. So there's no way of having both secular and Islamic knowledge, or if you do, then they exist in two very separate spheres. So you go and, for example, be a doctor or a pharmacist or a public speaker or whatever, and you've got your set of morals there that align with the secular knowledge you picked up, because these are the ones that taught you how to behave in this way and how to exist in this world. And then when you go home, you pick up your Islamic morals once again, because your teachers at home and how to conduct home life have been your parents or your uncles, your aunts, whatever, and that's how you conduct yourself in that sphere. But the two never cross over. So there's never been any example in current institutions, definitely, Western institutions anyway, of how do I be a Muslim whilst also, for example, being a doctor? How do I not compromise on my beliefs? And there's always almost like this internal struggle of how do I not compromise, basically, or, but, and then the other question is, but why do I have to be constantly be thinking about this? Like, what is wrong with taking secular knowledge for the sake of secular knowledge and being Islamic when I want to be Islamic? I'll share my thoughts in a sec, but I wanted to hear what you guys have to say about that. Is there anything wrong with secularizing your knowledge, aside from this whole, it's weakening your iman a bit? But some people would say, but it's not. I'm fine. I'm a good Muslim at home and a good banker at work. What's the problem?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think it's possible to, legitimately do that without actually running into, theological problems or, actually contradicting your iman. Because I think some people think that I can go to work and not, it's not that I'm doing anything haram, I'm just not, talking about God all day. What's wrong with that, I think it's, when we say, you're going into your job or, you're taking secular knowledge and then applying it to your job, it's not that you just, you don't say Bismillah before you go into surgery or whatever. But, you actually, your ethics are going to be affected by, your belief system. So are you gonna, are you gonna perform, a third-term abortion? I don't know. Are you gonna, the issue of ethics is so present in science. I don't think I even need to get into all the issues that come up with organ donation or euthanasia. Is that what it's called? Yeah. So there's so many different issues that come up. And then same thing with at least in the development field. I saw this a lot when I took courses about of applied development programs and looking at development measures. These were economics classes looking at how do we actually improve development in underdeveloped countries, and they already start with assumptions one measure of development is more access to contraception and abortion, less, they don't say it like this, but they're kind of assumed, or they assume that a more progressive developed society is one where women and men mix more, so there's less segregation, they have access to all the same spaces and spheres and everything, which none of us are saying that that's like impossible, that it doesn't exist in Muslim societies, that didn't even exist among the Sahaba. But like, you know, if you're gonna like propose like mixed educational spaces, then as Muslims we also have to say, okay, then like we can't do that without teaching the guidelines of gender interaction and like the khalwa is haram and all this stuff, you know. So you can never, I don't think you can truly separate the two, or like walk into a space and be like, just like leave your Islam at the door without actually doing something that's problematic. Like it's wrong. It's not just like you're leaving the barakah at the door, but like I think you're, you know, you can't put aqidah to the side for a minute and then like, you know, go do your job. So
yeah, no, absolutely. I think it also comes down to the crux of this issue is, what is the purpose of this knowledge? You know, oftentimes people think that, you know, yeah, I'm going to university because I you know, I want to get a job afterwards, and, you know, I want to contribute to this field. And obviously those are absolutely fine, very, very praiseworthy goals and ambitions. But obviously, as Muslims, our ultimate goal is the akhirah. We need to think how our future profession, or how our attainment of knowledge lines up with that and with our actions that we're doing to get to our final destination. And also I think that it is time as well for us as Muslims in the world to, yeah, we want to contribute to the world, and we want to do it for the sake of Allah. We want to do it via Islam. If we really love and have so much pride in our religion, then we should be wanting to do it to elevate Allah's word upon this earth. And I think that there are just so many fields and so many areas where we as Muslims could be contributing via Islam and for the sake of Islam, which not only sort of, you know, would get us obviously a lot of reward, but also would help the world, as in just, you know, not even just Muslims, but the whole world is, I think, in so many ways just imploding. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the solutions. We need to sort of look at what exactly can I contribute and what can I take from Islam and share with the world, in order that we as all of humanity will inshallah eventually benefit. And I know that sounds like, you know, the most idealistic, unrealistic vision ever, but I think that as Muslims we should have a little bit of that. You know, obviously you have your practical steps to get somewhere, but we, you know, as Muslims we are idealists. The very fact that we're even striving for Jannah is an ideal, subhanAllah, because it's not by virtue of any of our actions that we're going to get there. It's Allah's mercy, and therefore it's not because of our own amazing capabilities that we're going to achieve any of this. Again, it's Allah's mercy, and it's Allah who gives us victory. So we need to start just imbibing those visionary ideals more within ourselves.
Yeah. And not to be a voice of, you know, doom and gloom or anything, but it just reminds me of that ayah in Surah Al-Kahf, ayah 104. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you know, they are those whose effort is lost in worldly life while they think that they are doing well in work. Basically, they think that they're gaining so much, but really they're the losers. And that's not to say, obviously, there's anything wrong with going out making a living, or, you know, doing well and being a representative person in whatever field you choose. But look at the effort you're expending, and it should be proportional to what you're getting out of it. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're not going to break your back for like this tiny piece of zinc. You might do it for a piece of gold, but if it's like a bit of lint, you're not going to, you know, break your back over it, are you? Just like, yes, you know, you should have, you know, food on your table and alhamdulillah, a good standard of living, but not at the expense of your akhirah. And not at the expense of your Islam or your morals. And I think it's really a fallacy, and life is too short. It's really, really too short to ever forget that at the end of the day, we are all going to be, you know, bodies in the ground, and Allah's going to ask us what we spent our lives doing. And if it's, you know, to say we're going to, you know, I worked my way towards a Mercedes-Benz or a big house, you know, that's really not going to cut it. And obviously, you know, you have those who work, you know, to provide for their families, mashallah, and that is a rewardable action. You know, there are ways to do it with Allah in mind, but if you have constantly divested yourself of deen in the pursuit of secular things or in worldly things, then you're not going to remember that until it's too late.
Yeah, just to add as well quickly, I think it would be really nice if perhaps after this podcast, or just, you know, inshallah afterwards, people from different educational backgrounds like get in touch and sort of share perhaps their experience of how, in sort of, you know, perhaps upon sort of contemplating on this idea, how is it that we can use different areas and different sort of streams and paths in life for the sake of Allah. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about, say, like psychiatry or medicine. Obviously, there's huge discoveries that can be made in both of those areas. looking at what Islam has already done and building upon that. You were talking earlier about that, Sarah, with Professor Malik Badri's translation and how that has contributed to sort of psychology. And obviously you've talked a lot as well about development and, you know, sort of economics and perhaps a bit more broadly even sort of looking at politics and governance. But I'd be super interested to hear about, you know, people I don't know who do, I don't know, maths or architecture. Having said, I mean, actually there's a really interesting lecture that me and you attended, Sarah, about sort of architecture and
city planning
and how that also can be Islamic inspired. I mean, just to get sort of that conversation started, because I think a lot of people might be sitting there and like, okay, this sounds good, but what does it mean? And I think that we can all engage, inshallah, in a constructive discussion about that. It's not saying we have all the answers, but it's just sort of making that something that we need to consider.
Can I just share something? Because I mean, I didn't mean to sound like a basher, and I realise that I might have come across like that, but I don't. But it's just when you start thinking about it, subhanAllah, you see the beauty of Islam and, you know, in Allah's creation, everything that you do. When you start thinking about it, like that thing you were talking about, city planning, there are so many examples. I remember when I was reading up about Islamic architecture, when they actually designed houses, for example, with a door knocker. One was like a really high-pitched knock and one was a really low-pitched knocker, so that the person behind the door, like the inhabitants of the house, knew whether the guy at the door was a male or a female. So accordingly, a woman or a man could answer the door with or without hijab, which I thought was like so cool. But I mean, just in medicine, because I remember when I graduated, or just before I graduated, this is going to sound really dumb, but I was suddenly really scared, like, oh, subhanAllah, I've spent 6 years studying this thing, but how do I relate it to Islam? Like, how do I relate it to my deen? How do I make it a worthy thing? Like, and this might sound ridiculous because you're like, oh, but you're saving lives, duh. And I'm like, yeah, but how? Because like literally no one in my 6 years of medical education, as in my academic tutors, had ever made that link for me. And it was only after I started working, alhamdulillah, I just started seeing it everywhere. Like, and I've shared this on a couple of my personal platforms, but just about how, for example, you know, obviously I see a lot of sick people and I see a lot of people who die. And there was a specific one night that I was working where I had to go and certify 7 deaths. So that night in the hospital, 7 people had died.
SubhanAllah.
And it was my job to go to check the pulse and make sure this person had genuinely died, was no longer breathing, their heart had stopped, and my name as the doctor would be on that piece of paper saying this man is certified dead, and I was the doctor who did it. And A, the responsibility of making that proclamation was huge, and B, I've never been that close to a dead body before. And subhanAllah, like I was there and I was shaking and I could feel my pulse beating in my throat, and I was touching this man who's, you know, had no pulse, but I was pressing so hard out of fear. I could feel the pulse in my fingertips, and sometimes I thought it was his, and it freaked me out so much. And then you leave and you think, subhanAllah, you come so close to death and you see so many people, and just, you know, just health in general, it just makes you think of the qadr of Allah and sickness and shifa and the miracle just of you being alive. And like Aisha Hage was saying, I would really, really love to hear about, you know, the rest of you guys out there with, you know, the various professions you're in and ways that you have remembered Allah or Islam, and either ways that Islam can make it better, because trust me, the social system and social healthcare needs a lot of work, which I've seen firsthand, but I'd love to hear about the other sectors as well.
Yeah, that's something that we didn't even touch upon yet, which is that, like, approaching your studies and your career from, like, with, you know, that, like, really real conception of yourself as a Muslim, the reality of Islam and of Allah, it also just, like, it allows you to get more out of what you do. Like, it allows Aisha as a doctor to, like, when she works with patients, she doesn't just, you know, like, go home and then go to sleep and wake up the next day and be like, okay, another day of work. Like, her work reminds her of the akhirah. And, like, if she hadn't come into that, you know, like, with, you know, like, a real conception of, like, and just, you know, a very strong
waste.
Yeah, like, and you're like, your strong belief and identity as a Muslim, then you wouldn't have gained that. But also, going back to something that, like, I find really interesting is that, like, Aisha H was talking about idealism, and then Aisha A, you kind of started talking about realism. And I always see people talk about, like, optimism, pessimism, and realism as 3 different things. Optimism and idealism are, like, synonyms here. But I actually think that, like, from an Islamic perspective, that realism and idealism are the exact same thing. Because the reality is that Allah controls reality, that Allah has unlimited capability, and that if you ask Allah for ideals, He grants them to you. And Allah is the most merciful. He does, like, actually tell us that, like, He's gonna give us these, like, you know, ideal realities. So I don't think that, like, those two things are even different approaches or different perspectives, but, like, you need that reality of Allah as the, you know, as like the turner of hearts and as the controller of the dunya to, like, have that understanding. And also, I hope that people understand that, like, we're not here to discourage people from going to university and from getting a degree, from studying what, like, people will call the secular sciences or whatever. And all of us here, like, either, like, you guys went into grad school, you're doing it now, or, like, we want to, you know, like, we all really, you know, like, we have some, like, aspirations in the academy, but because we, you know,
I'm done with education, by the way. I think I've had
it.
enough.
I mean, like, you've done plenty, mashallah. But, like, because we care about it and because we want to, you know, like, we see a future for ourselves in it and we think it's useful, we really care about how we approach it and how others approach it. And in the light of that, like, in that spirit of trying to encourage people to approach this from, like, the best perspective possible, we want to talk a bit about one of the, like, articles that we published recently, which was our university reading list. And this was basically we publish monthly or, like, bi-monthly reading lists where we encourage people to, you know, like, we just share a few different titles that we think are worth reading, but this one we curated specifically as, like, for those of you who are about to start university. I need to, like, continue using that.
Don't worry, we understand.
Yeah. Not, you know, we're using universal language here. But for those of you who are about to start university, who are in it, like, some books that we think will be useful for you as a Muslim, navigating that, especially in the light of this issue of, like, secularization. So if you guys want to read the list, go for it. It's on our website. But for those of you who don't have time to read these books or whatever, we also just wanted to talk about it briefly now, like, why we suggested these books and what insights we think that they provide. But Aisha, if you want to go ahead and, like, talk about either... Yeah, do you want to start us off talking about, like, one of the ones that you recommended specifically?
Yeah, sure. Before I do that, I think, Sarah, you need to put that quote on one of those inspirational quote pictures. You know, optimism, pessimism, and realism, and how it's all the same.
I'll make a Tumblr.
Honestly. Okay, yes, the book list. Again, this was your smart idea, mashallah. One of the ones that I recommended was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And this was one that I ashamedly only read this summer, although it's been on my reading list for a long while. And subhanAllah, it was just such a beautiful book. Like, I didn't expect it to be as, like, perspective changing as it actually was. It's one of those books everybody talks about and, you know, sort of really loves, and so arguably should have expected it, but it was because of all the hype that I thought it's not going to live up to the hype. But subhanAllah, it really did. First of all, just the narrative and the way that it's written is so powerful. Like, just hearing, you know, Brother Malcolm talk in the way that you can imagine he would have spoken at that time, it really gave you a direct connection to him and his struggles. He's also got a very... It's just a really, I don't want to say blunt because that often has negative connotations, but a very direct, plain speaking way in which he simplifies very complicated realities into really easily understandable, like, paragraphs. You know, things that people debate about sort of so much and there's so much controversy over. He just states it the way it is, very directly, and you're 100% convinced. And it really hit me specifically in the first chapter when he's talking about his early life and how he was eventually separated from his mum and his siblings. He talked about sort of the role of the social worker in that, and basically how sort of the social worker was an agent of the state that was sort of very keen and had specific stereotypes, first of all obviously about the black family, but then wanted to, you know, came with a very specific objective, not even for the welfare of Malcolm and his brothers and sisters, the children in this situation, but wanting to separate them from the off, and how that is an insidious role of a social worker and the state's way of organising and penetrating within the private sphere of the family. He says it much better than that, obviously, but it was just the way in which he articulated this point, which has been said to me by others for a long time, and I did kind of have that sort of understanding before, but the way he just nailed it in the first chapter, I was just, like, blown away. And then, subhanAllah, everything about, all of his activism, his how he became so prominent, and then obviously how he found Islam. SubhanAllah as well, I was just, as I was reading it, I was just like, I can totally see why Allah chose him to be Shaheed, because his clarity is just unparalleled. And even the fact that when he was on Hajj, and then when he went to Egypt and other places in Africa, after sort of towards the end of his life, he met so many amazing people. Like, it was just qada. Like, people were just like for example, the Imam of Al-Aqsa happened to be walking in the lobby of the hotel that he was staying in, and it was just like, subhanAllah, Allah just wanted to bring him together with good, blessed people, and really just prep him for his ultimate role in bringing sort of obviously real Islam back to the US, and then sort of still maintaining his positions and uncompromisingly maintaining his positions. And all in all, it was such an inspiration. I think I should stop now, but it was just like really, really eye-opening on so many levels. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah. Also, like, just the fact that, like, I don't know how many scholars and, like, people in general I've met were like, yeah, I converted to Islam after reading the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Exactly.
And, like, it's such a testament to just like how important that book is, but also what you're saying about like how he speaks with such conviction, and like people crave that so much, especially today where people are like, everybody, like even people who strongly believe something, they're wishy-washy when they state it publicly or when they state it in like mixed spaces or whatever. And the fact that he just like unabashedly like states his belief in Islam, and like his like really accurate assessment like of the police state, of like white supremacy in the US and everything. And the fact that like he also, it wasn't like, oh, like when he became more spiritual and like his iman increased, that he became less politically active or like less interested in combating in fighting the state actively. Like that's not at all the case with like Malcolm. And I like, rahimahullah, may Allah have mercy on him, and like join us with him in Jannatul Firdaus. But like that is just a testament to like the reality of iman and how it doesn't take you away from being politically active, and like that it is really immediately applicable for people who are probably going to find a lot of different like strains of activism on campus, and just like how to navigate that in a principled way as a Muslim is like really important to learn about. But I can talk about the next book on the list, which is Tawheed, its implications for thought and life. And this book is like, it's really interesting. I think if we're, it might be useful to mention that the autobiography of Malcolm X is like an easier read, I think, because it's like, this one, Tawheed, is kind of, it can get like, into those discussions about like philosophy, epistemology, that get a little like highbrow. Like it's dense for me to read sometimes, but I still think it is like really important to read. And it's written by Ismail Farouqi, rahimahullah, who was the founder of Triple IT. I think a lot of people have heard of the institution. But this book, it expounds upon the foundation of our belief, right, which is like the oneness of Allah. But it takes it so much further, because prior to reading it, I was like, okay, Tawheed just means that there's one God, like that, like, and it stops at that statement. But he's, like the subtitle of the book, it's implications for thought and life. That's what he expounds upon. But like, okay, what does it actually mean now? If you believe in Tawheed, like, how do you act with your family? How do you engage with society? How do you engage in politics, in law? And that like, that's immediately applicable for everybody, and especially for people who are like going to be going into university and they're going to be instructed on how to lead the rest of their lives. You have to be instructed on that, like, with the belief in Tawheed first and foremost. And then another book on the list, which is Purification of the Heart, that's like translated and has a commentary by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. This one is like, it like speaks for itself. I don't know how much more we can talk about it, but like, specifically we wanted to include something about like tazkiyah and about just like combating the diseases of the heart, and like actively working to combat those things. This is applicable for like throughout your whole life. I've heard like scholars say that you should read this book like once a year, or something similar to it. But especially, I think it's important to mention that like in the university setting, it's like it can be so conducive to arrogance and just like self-righteousness, and like people, and that especially happens when you're in a bubble of people your own age, who all think that like they're doing groundbreaking things and that they're going to graduate and change the world. Like you really need to be brought down to earth, and just like, like somebody needs to, you need to keep yourself in check spiritually, with that.
Yeah, no, for sure. You're right. Probably just to mention sort of the thinking behind recommending each of these books. As you said, the first one was, something aimed at tazkiyah and, obviously, as it says, purification of the heart, keeping things in check. The second one that you were mentioning about Tawheed was obviously just to sort of give the foundations upon which our worldview and our thinking should be based on. Then Autobiography of Malcolm X was an example of like activism, and an uncompromising activism sort of in the face of so much, I guess, fitna, you would say, and absolute oppression. And then finally, it was Why Liberalism Failed, which you recommended to me a while ago, and I really, really love it. Again, it was just...
You want to talk about it?
Yeah, it was just such an eye-opener. And I think definitely sort of a very timely book. It was written only, I think, last year, 2018. So it very much takes into account sort of current political crises, like the election of Trump, Brexit, overall sort of the rise of kind of populist politics and things like that. It talks about sort of the destruction of the family unit, a loss of trust in authority, poor distribution of wealth, decay in traditional institutions, a growing disillusionment with progress. Like it's all of the things that we are seeing around us, but contextualizing that in the history of how liberalism as this political project kind of was implemented. And I'm not obviously going to go over it because I already spent too long on the last book, but just to quickly highlight one part, which was a real favorite of mine. He talked a lot about anti-culture, and I don't know, perhaps you can help me sort of define this, because I guess anti-culture in the way of kind of what we were talking about in terms of, and I guess you would define it as a secular culture, a secular monoculture that is loath to any kind of differences in people's perspectives about things. And basically he identifies 3 pillars of anti-culture. The first being the conquest of nature, which I think is obviously super relevant right now with a lot of conversation going on about sort of the climate and what we're doing to the planet and how we instrumentalize the planet. The second being considering time as a pastless present where the future is distant. And I thought that, again, that was really powerful. Again, in what we were talking sort of almost about secularization, as though we've always been in this situation now, as though sort of the pursuit of knowledge is something, it's not normative, it's objective. And the future is distant, so really you just live in the present and you don't actually sort of think or plan too much for the future. And the third was having a default condition as homelessness, and he sort of elaborates a little bit more on this idea of just sort of talking about how in a globalized world people don't have a connection to their land, to their home, to their community. And so, they're very happy to move around because they haven't got any sort of links, and how that weakens the social bonds in communities and in society. So, like, I think that is just a small window into the kinds of things that he's dissecting in the book. I really enjoyed that as well.
Yeah, that whole book is like, it's really interesting. And the guy who wrote it, Patrick Deneen, I'm pretty sure he's a Christian. So like, there's even like things in there that like you have to pick apart as a Muslim and think about like, okay, how would we maybe approach this differently?
Of course.
But in addition to like what you said about like there's so much in it that is just like applicable to, like our modern condition or whatever. But also specifically why I wanted to include it in the book list was because I think people, especially on like in the campus setting, you're given this like dichotomy between left and right, and people are going to push you to like identify with some point on the spectrum or like with some political leaning. And this is like the one time in your life where there's going to be like a lot of Marxists telling you that you should be a Marxist. Like I think it probably won't happen outside of that, but like you might encounter it there. But this is to like, that book really shows you how like that spectrum, first of all, is like kind of nonsense, but also how like everybody who's like on that spectrum and who identifies with it kind of like they all come from the same point of like all of their thoughts and ideas have the same point of origin, which is like liberal thinkers, post-enlightenment. So just like be woke to the reality of all of that. Like don't drink the Kool-Aid is what we're saying.
Just to add, funnily enough that you say that, I've actually read some reviews and criticisms of the book calling it Marxist. So, which I think is just a default thing to just chuck at anything that kind of tries to critique like the modern world these days. So I agree with what you're saying 100%, but it's just ironic that, that this is...
No, some people will call it Marxist, some will call it like libertarian. Like,
yeah,
I think the historical analysis is the important part, but what you decide are like, okay, how do we move forward from this now?
Exactly.
Like, what are the solutions that we need to come up with? Like, maybe you could take a Marxist approach to, you know, solving it, but yeah, that's a good point.
We'll do that in our next podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, like, a couple of other, like, articles that I would add to this, you know, like, reading recommendations that are not in the original list, but I think are especially relevant to, like, the discussion we've had today on the podcast. 2 articles from Renovajo, which is, like, Zaytuna College's journal. But one is called Of Canons and Canons. That's canons with 2 N's and then with 1 N. But this is talking specifically about how the, like, European education system was then exported to, like, all of their colonies, and how even in the experience of, like, decoloniality and, like, post-colonialism, it's been kind of, like, you know, we've been, like, navigating how to, you know, like, we have these systems that were kind of imposed on post-colonial countries, but they haven't been totally, you know, like, purified of them yet, if that makes sense. And how he's specifically talking about the education system. Yeah. So that's a really interesting read. And also earlier, because we did kind of mention pluralism, and I think it may have come off as us, like, because we talked about it so briefly, as us just trashing pluralism, being like, yeah, there's no need for it. That's not what we meant. But I think understanding what pluralism is and, like, when it's useful, when people are saying pluralism, but they mean perennialism. Yeah. Exactly. I think there's, like, a really interesting article, again, on Renovajo called Among the Disbelievers, that just gets into this, and I think it's pretty cool.
I think, for sure, like, pluralism, I think this is, the issue. There is not pluralism, unfortunately. There's not a genuine pluralism. It is, as you were saying, perennialism. Yeah. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. So, we've gone over an hour, alhamdulillah. I think this was a pretty dope episode, alhamdulillah. It was, like really fun to discuss these things, honestly. And also, if other folks want to share, like, again, their experiences with, like, their own academic disciplines and how they had to navigate these issues and that with us, that would be really cool. And also any other reading recommendations that are related to this, we would love to hear that from you guys. But with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. Please check out all of our previous episodes. Our articles are on our website, which is qarawiyyinproject.co. We're on social media. On Facebook, we're the Qarawiyyin Project. On Twitter, we are at Qarawiyyin Proj, and we also have an Instagram now at Qarawiyyin Project. So go ahead and follow us on those platforms, and we will speak to you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.